joining us. Thank you also for those of you who are watching on the webcast. My name is Kevin Book, and I am a senior associate here at the Energy and National Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, quite a mouthful, and also head of the research team at Clearview Energy Partners. And today we're going to talk about the Renewable Fuel Standard, the RFS, a topic that has occasioned a lot of comment here in Washington, a lot of consternation sometimes, not just here in Washington, but also around the country. I have a very great panel that I will introduce to you in a moment, and they're going to lead off with some presentations. We'll have some questions among ourselves, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for hopefully a fulsome and detailed discussion. And let me begin, if I can, by framing the issue. Those of you who have cars or who use cars that burn gasoline have probably gone to a dispenser recently enough to fill those cars and seen that it says something like contains 10% ethanol. It was not always so. Ethanol is an oxygen-containing, octane-enhancing compound used in gasoline, but it is not the only one. And it is 10% of our gasoline mix today in the United States for a variety of reasons that are both economic and political, but also regulatory and legislative in nature. And it is an unstable equilibrium because the way the program was originally conceived arrived at a time of scarcity, at a time when American energy policy was focused on just trying to get enough. And ethanol really played a role in the fuel mix as a supply extender, what one might refer to as a supplement, not so much a substitute, but a way to extend the light product mix a little further when we were short light crude, short refining capacity, and it seemed that our consumption would ever trend upward into greater dependence on foreign supply. It also finds its roots in agriculture and the fabric of the American Farm Belt, which is not a small thing. It's a very powerful force here in Washington and a very prized part of American history. And I think you'll find that there's complexity, not just because there's many people who may work in the petroleum industry who also have friends and family who are farmers, but because there are many who recall when ethanol and before it methanol and other alternative fuels were a vital substitute that were deemed essential to energy independence and later energy security. So we're going to have an unalloyed, cold-hearted, apolitical look at the program and where it stands today. And to do that, we're going to review sort of in succession through opening remarks the overall look at the program historically, and Jim Stock, who I'll introduce in a moment, will cover that. And then Akash Doshi is going to take us through the market circumstances as they stand today. And Ron Minsk will follow up with some commentary about where the program is and how and to what extent it might or might not be meeting its original goals. But so if you'll join me first in welcoming our speakers, Jim Stock, who's to my immediate right, is the Harold Hitchings Burbank Professor of Political Economy, Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and member of the faculty at Harvard Kennedy School, which I fumbled his title almost as much as I fumbled my own. But in any case, Jim is well known here in Washington for his insights and analysis into ethanol and biofuels, both in his role as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors and subsequently through his academic research. Very insightful, and the discussion we were just having out front, I think, is any predictor. We're going to be getting deeply into the weeds. Some of those weeds may be crop feedstock weeds, some may be non-crop feedstock. Ethanol joke. Okay, moving on. Akash Doshi is commodity strategist for Citigroup in New York. He writes research reports, as I once did, for investors who are, by their nature, demanding of incisive analysis, quantitative assessments. It requires a great deal of skill and capability to not only distill, no pun intended, and communicate the complexities of the RFS. And Akash's work looks at both the fundamentals and the policy components of the biofuels program, and so his insights will be very welcome. And Ron Minsk, who's all the way at the end, you may recall having seen him in some capacity as a member of the National Economic Council, not just in the Obama administration, but in the Clinton administration. Ron has a deep background, not just in biofuels or energy, but in policy writ large. He approaches the issue from a variety of different directions. He was on watch during the Obama administration when the blend wall approached, which makes his insights particularly useful in understanding some of the complexities, advantages and disadvantages of different configurations of the program. I should note that Ron is currently a fellow at the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia, and separately he advises obligated parties that are short RINs. His thoughts and the thoughts of all the speakers will be ours in just a few minutes. So let's start with Jim.
Okay, thanks, Kevin, and it's a pleasure to be here. It is always fun to talk about the RFS, an evergreen issue. I am going to resist the temptation of jumping into the weeds immediately, and what I'm going to do is try to give you a high-level, broad overview of where the RFS started, what the policy goals are. Has the RFS been successful in achieving its original goals, and then what's staying at a high level, what are some of the issues that we'll be confronting in the next over the course of the next year? How should we think about those? And then we'll, I'm sure, have plenty of time to get into the weeds later in questions and also in the other steps in the panel. Okay, so the RFS has, let me see if I can get this thing to work. Should have practiced. Oh. Okay, so I'm sorry.
We're bringing in skilled assistance, Jim. Help is on the way.
Which button do I hit here? The skilled assistants managed to turn the device on. Okay. Okay. RFS had EISA 2007 had three main goals. Okay, the first goal is to enhance energy security, as Kevin referred to. That was a very, very different time than we're in right now. Much, much higher oil imports, projections of gasoline consumption continuing to grow. Needed to do something. But domestically produced biofuels is one of the answers, or one of the proposed ideas. Second, support rural incomes, something that is always of interest here, and that's an explicit goal of the program. And third, an explicit goal of the program is to develop and enhance low greenhouse gas transportation fuels, climate emissions reduction. The way it was structured, both in the legislation and then in terms of the implementation, is a nesting structure where there are, broadly speaking, 4 different types of fuels. There's cellulosic biofuels. Those are the concept of the second-gen stuff for the future. There's biomass-based diesel. If you want to think about that as waste grease, soybean oil, that sort of stuff. That's a technology that's existed for many, many years. There's remaining advanced fuels. So those are other largely, but not technologies that are nascent. And then there's conventional biofuels. Think corn ethanol here, but it's not entirely corn ethanol, and we'll discuss those. So where have we come? I'm going to give you the big picture. Where have we come? What do we know? How far has the progress been in these 3 different areas? On energy security, I'd say we've made substantial progress. The original goal was to get about 15 billion gallons of conventional domestic biofuels into the marketplace. That's basically happened. We're not quite at that total for domestic, but that's basically happened. There's been substantial increases in biofuels, biomass-based diesel beyond that was projected or thought of and contemplated in the statute. So there's been substantial displacement. It's certainly, in terms of ranking of domestic security, it's been nowhere near as important as the fracking revolution and domestic oil production, but it has played a role, and I think we can't forget that. In terms of rural incomes, there's no question but it's played a role. A very substantial fraction of corn is now being used to produce ethanol. A substantial fraction of virgin vegetable oils are being used to produce biodiesel. Both of those have bolstered farm incomes and bolstered demand for farm commodities. So it's been successful in that regard. Third, low GHG transportation fuels. It's here where I think we've really fallen short, and to preface where I'd like to see the program go in the future, is to really refocus and pivot. So it's that third goal, which we have not really achieved, is something that we can focus on going forward. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of slides that summarize this. The first slide looks at the impact, look at what's happened to first-generation fuels. So the green line is corn ethanol. Actually, it's total ethanol, but almost all of that is corn ethanol, corn kernel ethanol. And you can see how that's increased substantially from low volumes in the early 2000s, and then since the passage of the RFS 2 under the EISA 2007, there's been a very significant increase in corn ethanol. The blue line is 10% of motor gasoline, and you can see that around 2012, we basically got to 2013, we basically got to just within spitting distance of 10% of motor gasoline, and now we're actually somewhat above 10% of motor gasoline. I think it's 10.05, if I remember correctly, in terms of ethanol penetration. So we're getting a little bit more than E10, and that's the so-called blend wall. The statutory conventional level here is, as 15 billion gallons of ethanol, of conventional fuels, and we're just shy of that in terms of ethanol. So I would say that we've essentially achieved that part of the goal of the RFS. Biodiesel has had substantial growth. The growth of biodiesel has been in excess of the statutory volumes. That's really limited by the supply and demand, basically the supply curve for feedstocks. And as you produce more biodiesel, it just gets more expensive feedstocks, and you're competing with other uses of soybean oil, and that's an expensive thing to look at. Second generation fuels, things have been much slower and more disappointing than had been hoped for in the statute. Non-ethanol advanced has pretty much just held steady, and here I'm thinking of things like bio-naphtha and so forth. Recently there was a cellulosic gas pathway that's been approved for CNG, and that's been taking off, but that's a fairly mature technology. The technology that was really supposed to be the big central feature of the RFS in terms of low GHG fuels has been cellulosic ethanol. Cellulosic liquids have been very disappointing historically. There's a whole host of reasons for that. You'll see on the upper right-hand side one of my favorite pictures in this whole area, which is actually an at-scale commercial plant. That's the pipe that delivers the treated cellulosic liquid fuel to the distiller. So all of the hard part of cellulosic was done upstream of where this photograph was taken. This technology exists, and the total nameplate capacity in this area is now around 60 million gallons. I think the question going forward is going to be how to promote that. So let me just briefly, and I want to make sure I don't go over my time limit here. Let me just briefly outline what I would suggest as some goals for reform. And I'm sorry, let me preface something. Let me preface this slide with a key point. We are now at a turning point in the RFS. There's several reasons for saying that. That's a problem. All right, there's several reasons for saying that. Reason number one is that we're basically at the blend wall. We're basically at 15 billion gallons of conventional ethanol. That first generation fuel has essentially, that goal has been achieved. Second, biodiesel, that first generation goal, that has been achieved. So I think we can put those in the rear view mirror. Point two is we have fallen short, the program has fallen short on advanced second gen fuels, but that technology is now ready. There are plants that are at commercial scale that could actually be stimulated. They satisfy what continue to be important to energy security goals. Just because we have fracking doesn't mean that that's not important. It's less important perhaps, but it's still an important goal. They satisfy supporting farm incomes, and absolutely what they satisfy, where the program has fallen short so far, is in supporting low GHG fuels. So I think we're at a turning point in terms of where we've come. We're also at a turning point in terms of something that's called the Statutory Reset, which is being triggered, which has been triggered, and the EPA is starting to go back and look at resetting the volumetric requirements and maybe more broad considerations in the program. And so this is really an opportunity for EPA and the rest of the community to take a forward-looking view of the RFS and see what we need to do. I would suggest 4 things. First, we want to reduce the compliance costs for first-generation fuels. First-generation fuels, those have succeeded under the RFS. Now let's turn our attention to the future. Second, we want to continue to support farm incomes, and there's some specific implications of that we can discuss. Third, probably want to support expansions of higher blends, and hopefully we'll get to talk about fun things like the Reed vapor pressure waiver for E15 plus. Fourth, we want to pivot towards second-generation fuels, and there's a host of detailed reforms that could go in that direction. Some of them might be regulatory, some of them could be legislative if we chose to go the legislative route. I've written a few specific issues here, but I think I'll leave it to the next speakers to go over some of those weeds, and we can follow up on them.
Thank you, Jim. Great overview. Energy security, farm incomes, and GHG reductions. Those are the goals laid out. Jim set out some goals for reform. Akash, you want to take us through the way the market looks and then the picture out there?
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Jim, for that presentation, and thank you all for being here and joining us. What I'll plan to do is kind of go over where the markets see the policy currently and what kind of are the headwinds and tailwinds for this program going forward. In my role at Citigroup, I'm a director in commodities research there. I head agriculture strategy there. I head the biofuels outlook. So I look at kind of both sides. I run sugar and corn global S&Ds. I run ethanol S&Ds, and I run RIN balances as well. I work a lot with transportation fuel refineries as well as ethanol producers directly. So I can kind of give you a corporate side as well as kind of a more banking side of what the market is thinking, as well as what hedge funds are thinking as well, because there are clearly implications of this. So I'm going to skip through the slides and go to the very end right now just to see what the market is focused on. So Jim did a great job, and I'm sure Ron is going to expand on, as well as Kevin later, about the kind of physical markets and fuel markets. I think related to the Renewable Fuel Standard, what the market focuses on right now a lot is called a RIN, or Renewable Identification Number. So essentially, as Jim outlined, you have a program or a policy that's upward sloping, that since its inception in 2005 and then updated in 2007, you are blending, or the EPA is requiring blending more biofuels into the U.S. transportation fuel system. And that was set out in the 2007 ESA law. What's happened since that time, fast forward a decade, is that gasoline demand in the U.S., because of fuel economy standards, because of changing demographics, huge other demand elasticity impacts when oil was $100 a barrel from 2010 to 2014, is that it's structurally a lot lower than was previously forecast by the EPA and Congress when it made this rule. And the issue that we see in the market is that there is obligation by the EPA put on to refiners or importers of gasoline and diesel that don't necessarily blend biofuels to separate RINs to show compliance, or organically generate RINs through other methods. So here's a good little, I guess you could say, a little flow chart of kind of how the RIN cycle, life cycle and dynamics work. So you have the renewable fuel producer on the top left. The RIN is attached to every gallon that's produced in the U.S., as well as qualified imported gallons, for example, from Argentina and Brazil, and it's attached to that renewable fuel. Then you have below that, you have kind of a refinery or an importer of gasoline and diesel. They are making and producing non-renewable fuels, typically from petroleum feedstock and crude oil. What happens is that the current mandate is really put on the refiner or importer of gasoline and diesel, but they're not organically generating the RINs. It's the blender that does that. And the refiner, the market, is arguing that we can't control blending because we're beholden to the racks. We're beholden to the market reality where we can't blend the amount of biofuels into the U.S. transportation fuel system economically in order to meet these targets. So what happens is they have to buy these surplus RIN credits from prior years that were banked due to overcompliance, and they have to buy these in the open market. And what do these RINs cost? I guess that slide was not at it. Oh, there it is. So these RIN prices are currently, for conventional ethanol RINs, around 80 cents a gallon. And for D4 biodiesel RINs, they're about 40-cent premium, so about 110 to 115 a gallon. If you notice, prior to 2013, the original year of RIN sanity, if you will, these conventional ethanol RIN prices were very low. They were only a few pennies. They averaged less than 5 cents a gallon. And that's because the EPA mandate at that time, because remember, it's upward sloping. When it initially started, you were well below what the refiners argue is the E10 blend wall, meaning that they're able to blend as much as the EPA wants. In fact, they're able to blend more than the EPA wants because they need ethanol as a source of octane, as an oxygenate. It replaced MTBE in the transportation fuel system. But since 2013, you can see how volatile the RIN prices were. If I took this chart back, going even back to 2010, you would essentially see RIN prices were, for the D6 RINs, were zero. The reason the D4 RINs are quite high there and there, the premium is, at the time, there was a $1 per gallon blender tax credit. That just lapsed at the end of 2016. We'll talk about that separately. But within that context, what you can see is that RIN prices have been very volatile since 2013. Now, some would argue that the EPA is okay with high RIN prices. Why? Because high RIN prices should generate the build-out of infrastructure, of mid-level blending, E15, E85. The problem is, if you look at the market reality of that, there really hasn't been that infrastructure build-out. The E10 blend wall is still relatively intact in the US, and the quantities or volumes of E15, E85 sold into the market are infinitesimally small. There's another issue for this, is that the infrastructure isn't even there. So even if you have a high RIN price, which would incentivize blending, why? Because if I'm a gasoline producer in PAD 3 in the Midwest, and I want to sell over to the New York Harbor, so I send it through a pipeline, right? I'm a price taker in that market. It's a very competitive market in Kansas, Oklahoma, et cetera. So I'm sending the gasoline over. The rack, they take title of the gasoline, they take title of ethanol, they splash blend it, and they're able to separate that RIN. The problem is that the policy is not on that blender who's separating the RIN, so they're not necessarily incentivized fully to build out the infrastructure that's required in order to sell E15, E85. And to be sure, there's only about 130,000 convenience stores that sell retail gasoline in the US. Maybe 3,000 to 4,000 sell these mid-level blends, E15, E85. Most of it is E85. So it remains a really elusive issue. Of those 130,000, about 60% are mom and pop owned. So it's unclear to me if they would even with high RIN prices, without government grants or subsidies, it's unclear to me they would even spend the infrastructure due to pump labeling issues, needing separate tanks, and other liability issues attached to selling mid-level blends to a degree. So the RIN prices have been very high this year. If you look at the final proposal for 2017, it continued that upward trajectory of the RFS program, well below what the statutory schedule called for, but is continuing to rise roughly at a 6% per annum rate over the last couple of years. For 2018, the Trump-Pruitt EPA did leave the rule essentially, for all intents and purposes, in our view, flat at 19.24 billion, total renewables at 10.6% blend rate. I apologize if some of these terms are technical or someone's lost and not following this. These slides can be available to you afterwards or during Q&A. But within that context, you saw the Trump-Pruitt EPA essentially leave the program flat, in my view, for all intents and purposes. And I think in that context, It's already a pretty binding environment. You have trouble getting over that E10 blend wall on the gasoline side. But there's two other issues in this current environment that are really making it a very difficult policy. One is that you have sluggish RIN generation, and that's due to a lack of a blender tax credit for biodiesel, as well as trade dispute issues, because we've been importing all of our D4 RINs, or at least a good chunk of them, from Argentina and Indonesia last year. And you look at where the biofuel trade lobby is, they're looking to, the biodiesel trade lobby is looking to put import duties on these. So right now you don't even have cargoes booked for later this year. Typically RIN generation seasonally ticks up in the second half of this year. So like any commodity, we look at this as RIN supply, RIN demand, and RIN inventory, so to speak, like you would any commodity. We see the supply side is struggling. We see the demand floor set by the EPA pretty sticky and high and binding. Therefore, we see the inventories of RINs, which at least are a bit higher than previously thought at 2 billion gallons, drawing and potentially going to zero in 2019, given without a policy shift. So I think it's a bit of concern, and the RIN price and those RIN dynamics is something that the market clearly is focusing on.
Thank you, Akash. That was terrific. You got the RIN life cycle, you got the supply struggling, the demand sticky, and the inventories drawing. Ron, take us home and tell us what we need to know about what the program should and shouldn't be doing.
Thank you very much. I also wanted to note that Jim was also he was my colleague at the time at the White House that we were going through this. And I think in many respects our perspectives are somewhat similar, although I think it may come across that I have a little more critical view of the program. So I agree with Jim. You know, when we look back at the statute, we see that the RFS, in my mind, was intended really to increase the volume of renewable fuel in the United States in order to reduce emissions from fossil fuels and in order to enhance energy security. And it was understood that in doing so, that would also affect job creation. It could affect the price of agricultural commodities. It could have positive impacts in rural economic development. And it could affect food prices as well. So these were all things that were kind of acknowledged in the statute. The program, as it's designed, through this RIN structure that we just heard about, essentially is a tax and subsidy program. It's imposing a tax on the less favored fuels, and it's supposed to use that, in effect, to subsidize the more favored fuels, which were, as I view it, primarily the cellulosic-based fuels that are in the D3 category. The idea was that by lowering the cost through that subsidy, you'd make them more affordable so that consumers could buy these otherwise expensive fuels. So when I look at it, I see that there were kind of two operational things that the program was intended to do. First was to get more volumes of these advanced cellulosic fuels into the marketplace. And then the second was to get larger volumes of the higher blends of ethanol fuels into the market in order to make room for these cellulosic as well as the conventional fuel in the marketplace. Essentially, I would say that the conventional fuels, although it's an important kind of byproduct of the program, I don't view it as primary a purpose. And I think the reason is probably twofold. One is that it was already a mature technology, even though the fuels were not widely used, but it was a mature technology at the time that the program was created. And second of all, it was, I think, easily achievable at a very low cost. And that is reflected in the fact that up until the time that we hit the blend wall, the RINs that reflected the cost of getting that fuel into the market were selling really for just a couple of pennies. EPA has said in a document last year that they viewed the program as a success, largely reflecting the fact that over 99% of the statutory volumes had made it into the fuel supply. I would look at it differently. I would say that last year, we were looking at a volume of cellulosic. The volume of cellulosic fuel last year was somewhere around, I think, 190 million gallons, but only 4 million of those gallons were liquid gallons, and liquid is the primary transportation fuel. And the volumes of high concentration fuels have also been low. So the volumes of E85 are probably somewhere around 150 million gallons. The volumes of E15 are also modest. I don't think in either of these that we have really good numbers because EIA doesn't collect data on these. And frankly, I still have the view that most drivers still don't even know what E15 and E85 are. At the same time, EPA itself has acknowledged, and Jim's research actually has also backed up the fact, that a substantial portion of the tax, the cost of the RIN, isn't making it through to the pump. In other words, we're taxing the fuel in order to subsidize other fuel, but a large portion of that, approaching 50%, is getting lost somewhere in the system. And we can have a discussion as to exactly where that's happening. So I'm sitting here and I'm looking at a program where I'm seeing that, you know, we don't have the high volumes of advanced fuels that we want to have in the program, and we don't have the higher concentrations above E10 that we need in order to make room. At the same time, we've had substantial compliance costs. The subsidy's not making it down to the pump, and fundamentally, no one has really figured out a way yet to market these fuels in a way that they will appeal, I think, to most drivers. So it feels kind of like we've, over the past 10 years, spent a lot of effort and not gotten a whole bunch done relative to what I kind of view is the overall purpose of the program. Now, don't get me wrong, I think it's an important program, but I think that it can be improved, and I share Jim's view that what we ought to really be doing is trying to focus on how to get the advanced fuels, which are the underlying goal in my mind, out there into the market. When we were at the White House, we had a list of ideas that we were running through trying to figure out how to make this work. We had ideas like approving new pathways, which EPA has done a good job at. We thought about trying to get E85 sold on an E10 equivalent price basis so that consumers can understand what it costs, because frankly, people don't even understand the relative energy content and the price of the fuel. We talked about better market transparency, thinking that if people had a better understanding of how the program would work, or who was involved, we could maybe have a better understanding of how it would work, and it might help us identify other improvements. We talked about things like price collars on the RINs to kind of limit the economic consequences. And then we had a couple of other ideas, including moving the point of obligation from the refiner to the blender, and also a build-out of infrastructure in order so that there'd be more of this fuel available at the retail level. In congressional testimony last year, I floated another idea, which would require legislation. And it was intended really at trying to get rid of the large costs of compliance with the conventional market, the D6 RIN, that the market is kind of burdened by today. The idea that I had put forward, which would have required legislation, would have been to essentially get rid of the D6 requirement altogether, get rid of the conventional requirement as part of this program, and replace it with a flat requirement that all fuel be blended at approximately 9.8%. In doing so, what you would do is you would still have space in the fuel supply for the corn ethanol that the farm community has come to rely on, and that has provided substantial volume, and yet you would get rid of all the inframarginal rents that are associated with the cost of those D6 RINs. I would also have suggested, or part of the proposal also, was to allow for lower blends of ethanol to be sold, although that they would pay a tax. So if someone wanted E0, you could sell E0, that's an ethanol-free fuel, or a lower blend, and yet you couldn't just ignore it. You'd essentially have to buy your way out of it. Recently, there's another idea floating around that's been floating around town that is a regulatory kind of version of that, and that is to essentially split out from the conventional fuel category the fuel that is blended in up to the blend wall, and essentially saying any fuel, the first 9.8% of ethanol that goes into a gallon of gasoline is one RIN, and then the fuel that's blended above that level to get to the higher concentrations required to the statute is a separate RIN, a D6A or a D8 or something to that effect. The purpose of that essentially is to get rid of all these inframarginal rents. The difference in that proposal and mine, I think the big differences are twofold. One is that mine would require legislation, and this probably should not. And second of all, my proposal essentially acknowledged that you would not get to the full 15 billion gallons of implied conventional that some stakeholders have come to rely on, although you'd be close to it, and this allows you to get over it. So I think that that's an interesting idea that's kind of floating around right now. Separately from that, in my testimony, I also indicated that if EPA wanted to do something by regulation, one of the things that they could do is move the point of obligation from the point at which the fuel is refined to the point at which it's blended, and that if this were paired with a good infrastructure build-out program, one which Jim and I both worked on when we were in the government, but was implemented, in my view, poorly after we left, although we wouldn't have probably been involved in the implementation at that level had we still been there, that if you were to pair these together, you could create better incentives both to get blending done at the rack, and you could help get more infrastructure out there at the local market level. Our idea was to put high concentrations of E85 pumps in a small number of communities so that you could erode the local market power that currently exists when you don't have pump-on-pump competition. And by doing so that you'd get the value of the RIN, which EPA itself has acknowledged isn't making it all the way down to the pump, you'd bring it down to the pump. In other words, the goal is to make sure that the entire value of the subsidy is getting through to the consumer, and in doing so, you'd lower the price and you'd hopefully increase the volumes that were being sold. So I'm going to stop there. We can talk about this or other proposals as we move on to our questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Ron. A very comprehensive and technical look. And, for those who are looking to a glossary, we will have a fulsome discussion to follow. Let me try to set up a few of my moderator's prerogative questions before we go to the crowd with a thought. The problem of scarcity had a superset of policy solutions that I will oversimplify as moving down the vehicles path or the fuels path. You had a whole bunch of old cars, and you had a whole bunch of old fuels. So what were you going to do? Well, do nothing, and you can go directly to the end user. Taxes, make demand more expensive and try to discourage it. You could, however, in government, look at trying to make new cars that were more fuel efficient, that used the old fuels, and in 2007, the Energy Independence and Security Act did just that, as well as supersizing the RFS, which moved down a different pathway, which was looking at using new fuels in the old cars. Now, there's a lot of talk today about the notion of new fuels and new cars, the beautiful electric vehicles that will be rolling off of Tesla's assembly line and into every man, woman, and child's parking slot within months, years, decades. Yet that's a double hop. So for policymakers, looking at either new fuels or new cars made for a more ready solution. The demand issue started to solve itself, as Akash mentioned, for a variety of reasons, fuel economy among them. And to some extent, the two policies in the Energy Independence and Security Act worked at cross purposes. As the gasoline pool shrank, you ended up with less gasoline to absorb the ethanol that was mandated by the same law, and created a policy conflict. And so this is not something that can necessarily be left alone. Ron took us through a couple of potential solutions, including a percentage standard, which is something that's common in other renewable fuels programs in other countries, but not here. And there's a reason, I suspect, why it wasn't done here. The constituents who were most worried about that second point that Jim outlined in his first remarks about farm income wanted to have certainty. And the Corn Belt prizes the certainty that the 15 billion gallon target that has been supported in both the current RVOs proposed by the Trump administration and the ones proposed last year by the Obama administration put out there. So I want to start with a question for the three of you as a whole, and it comes 2 weeks to the day after the EPA released their RVOs. It's a very simple question. Were you surprised by anything in the proposal? Jim, why don't we start with you, and press the red button, please.
No, I don't think I was particularly surprised. I guess the one thing that was interesting, and we can talk about this in more detail, to me was the flatlining of biodiesel, and that's the first time that has happened. I think there's some good logic in the proposal for doing that. Let me just say one comment on this new cars, new vehicles concept. There's a narrative, certainly among the green community, that biofuels were a thing of the past. They were last decade's technology. EVs are here, and that's the path for the future. I think we have to be very careful about these technologically based narratives. I would suggest that high energy density liquid fuels are going to have an important role for a long time to come. I don't know how you fly. Maybe someone clever is going to be able to fly an airplane or fly a jet on electricity, but we're a ways away from that in terms of batteries. And you need the fuel. You need the high energy density of liquid fuels. There are also remote applications, construction applications, and so forth, where these are important considerations. Plus, there's greenhouse gas emissions reductions considerations in the transition. So I guess I would argue against this sort of switching gears that EVs and Tesla are, we're done. We've been there, done that. I think we've got a lot of work ahead of us in this area. But in terms of the existing, in terms of the 2018 proposal, I guess the other thing I would say is it's interesting, not surprising, but an indication of commitment that the 15 billion gallon number continued through in terms of the conventional mandate, which is getting easier and easier to hit with ethanol as gasoline demand increases.
Akash?
Yeah, I echo Jim's statement there. Just to put some hard numbers, interesting. So if anyone wants to look at the growth of EVs, so the U.S. consumes roughly 145 billion with a B gallons of gasoline per annum. Does anyone want to venture to guess globally, worldwide, not just the U.S., how much electrical vehicles displace of gasoline use, estimated roughly? So U.S. is 145 billion gallons alone per year, probably around 2 billion gallons. So I think it's still a ways away, and I completely agree with Jim that it's going to be a phenomenon that's going to grow exponentially kind of in the mid-2020s beyond context, but it's not here yet. It's not a short-term solution. Regarding the policy, I'm a publishing analyst, so I have to make my views public and they're available to clients. So I was expecting the 15 billion gallons to stay intact. I think the policy as it currently stands, I think corn ethanol is a bipartisan. You have Joni Ernst from the Energy and Environment Senate Subcommittee and Bernie Sanders kind of both on the same page with corn ethanol. And I think Trump Pruitt were pretty clear on that. I am a little surprised that they are maybe looking for an advanced biofuel reset. I think that was one surprise that you saw. I would have expected the D4 volumes to grow in 2019 by 100 million gallons wet, as they have in the last couple of years, from 1.9 to 2.0 to 2.1 to 2.2, and they left it flat at 2.1. My bias is this was an initial rule. If I had to guess and where the market is pegging it, that there needs to be some policy relaxation in the final rule that'll come out at the end of November or December. So I think, without policy relaxation, I've been calling for $1 per gallon RIN price or higher since April. I think you will see that, and it'll continue to be a burden for merchant refiners and a boon for the blenders.
Ron, any surprises?
I'm not sure if I'd say I was surprised. I mean, I think that it's pretty clear that the Trump administration feels that the president made a commitment to support the corn component of this program, and that's reflected here. But I also think that they realize that they've got an ongoing concern about the costs of the program, or at least the perceived cost of the programs, is being spoken about by some stakeholder groups. I think maybe what was interesting is the extent to which they went out there and pretty aggressively, I think, asked for thoughts about the forthcoming reset, and yet I'm not sure what they can do in the reset that solves any problems, that doesn't kind of bump up against the same constituent concerns that are kind of already reflected in these numbers. I think that the reset is interesting, but some of these things need structural changes in the program in order to really resolve them. So I think that's
Jim, you wanted to add something?
I'm going to add just one thing. Yes, there's one other thing that I forgot that really was surprising to me, and it's only a paragraph or two, which is talking about whether or not the biomass-based diesel advanced D4 requirement might be you might consider subtracting out the amount of imports from that. And so that's actually a new idea, that the requirement would simply be reduced to compensate for imports, and I think that's consistent with the Made in America notions of this administration.
Jim, actually, that was a perfect segue to my second question, and yet hasn't answered it entirely. You outlined goals, farm income goals and GHG reduction goals for the program, but obviously the reliance on Indonesian and Argentine biodiesel undermines the domestic farm income goal of the program to some degree. And one might argue that the unsustainable way in which palm oil is produced might also undermine the greenhouse gas emissions goal, although there's endless debate to be found in the annals of EPA's archives about different feedstock life cycles of greenhouse gases. I encourage everyone who wants to sleep easy to start going through GREET pathways. But I guess my question is, this trade case that Akash mentioned, does this imperil or circumscribe the options for the EPA? If you can't import biodiesel, does it change the overall shape of the program in a way that essentially requires a reset out to 2022?
There's a fundamental tension here, is that we're trying to focus on a domestic market and a domestic program in products that are internationally traded, and that is going to get you into a whole host of really difficult conflicts and workarounds. I think Akash is going to be the right person to talk about the specific volumes and the effect of the imports. Let me say just one or two quick things in response to that. Yeah, I am very concerned about the Indonesian, from a pure environmental perspective, from the Indonesian imports. Now, the Indonesian imports are allegedly, or I'll take at face value, from pathways that are not the non-sustainable and environmentally sustainable palm oil pathways, but alternatively from fish oils, refuse oils, that sort of thing. On the other hand, demand is demand. And there's going to be some fungibility if we use one pathway and somebody else uses another pathway. If you're increasing demand, that's a concern. There's other concerns for even on the domestic side, because biodiesel is driving out. Biodiesel is competing with soy, which is a food-based crop. So I think that there's serious issues for concern. Exactly what one has scope to do within international trade laws and within the scope of the RFS as it's currently formulated, I think is pretty limited. And just the fix of removing biodiesel, even if you just take the fix of removing Argentinian and Indonesian biodiesel from computing the volumes, well, you actually all of a sudden get into real complications, because do you necessarily want to do that with cellulosic? Because of the failures of our programs to provide support for cellulosic, a lot of the cellulosic manufacturers, which are multinational companies, are producing it elsewhere. Does that mean we don't want to import the cellulosic that's produced in Central America? And I don't think so. I think that that's an industry that we want to support. So there's a whole lot of overlaps and concerns about that proposal, even within the context of the RFS.
To paraphrase, who knew that trade could be so hard? Akash?
Yeah, I think, Jim, just to give some hard numbers, so last year the U.S. imported a record 45,000 barrels a day of biodiesel. More than half of this was from Argentina. A good 15 to 20% was from Indonesia. We also imported around 14,000 barrels a day of renewable diesel from Singapore. That's the Neste facility that's over there, to go into PAD 5, which is California, which also imports a lot because of the low carbon fuel standard program there. To be very blunt, if they remove the imports out of the equation, or like they put in these countervailing, the anti-dumping case comes through at the end of August, and they put in a 24 to 34% tariff on Argentinian and Indonesian barrels. I mean, they are the lower cost producers of biodiesel. Argentina has a tiered structure where they essentially put a 30% export duty on local soybeans, 25% on soy meal and oil, but biodiesel at 0%. So they are subsidized. If you look last year, The U.S. guys were getting crushed in biodiesel because Gulf Coast basis was often trading at a discount to the Midwest where a lot of this biodiesel is produced. Typically, it should be trading at a premium, right? Because to represent the rail cost, which is roughly 10 to 20 cents a gallon equivalent from the Farm Belt out to the coast where it's consumed at the refinery level and consumer level. So I think within that context, if they lower, if they try to push out imports, but they don't lower the volumes, it's actually going to be, I think, a tighter and worse environment, right? So it has to be some sort of combination. Related to that is there are some proposals, and there are about, I think, a half a dozen proposals in Congress right now, but they need to really come back with a producer tax credit or a blender tax credit. There was never a producer tax credit. And that $1 per gallon blender tax credit is needed because biodiesel actually blends at a lower rate than corn ethanol into gasoline currently, and it's not as economical. I would argue that even without renewable fuel standards, talking directly to these refiners in Houston and along the Gulf Coast, we would have an E9 standard irrespective of the RFS policy at this point, because it succeeded in building out ethanol infrastructure and introducing ethanol into a U.S. transportation fuel supply. Without that $1 per gallon blender tax credit, which lapsed at the end of last year, without a producer tax credit, which could come back and could be America first under this administration, and if you don't have these imports, then it's a very difficult environment, I think, and you need that growth in RIN generation in the second half of the year. Otherwise, it's a very binding environment in my view.
Ron, any comments?
No, I mean, I guess if you have the duty imposed on the biodiesel, the price will go up, and the market will play out. I think the biggest concern there for me is that the price of the D4 acts as a backstop for the D6, and if you increase the price, if the price of D4 RINs go up because of imposition of a duty or because of reduced imports, and if you are at the blend wall to the point where the D6 obligation is being met in part by D4, you've just pulled the price of the D6 RIN up to reflect the consequences of the trade case, and you've just substantially increased the inframarginal rents that are being collected on every gallon of corn ethanol. And that's just a function of the nesting, that's laid out in the statute.
To that extent, the D6 RINs are even rising today another 4 or 5 cents. We're at 85 cents a gallon, new year-to-date highs. On the biodiesel side, where the market is pricing a potential return of the tax credit, and I base this on conversations in the physical swap market from a biodiesel producer selling to a blender, where the blender 50-50 splits $1 per gallon tax credit retroactively or keeps 100% of it. We see that basis differential at about 15 cents per gallon equivalent. You back that out onto $1 a gallon normalized, that would be about a 30% probability of that returning. So this is clearly, again, I would point to the markets, again, see this as a very binding mandate, and RIN prices are reflective of that right now.
I think one thing we need to keep in mind is how big the subsidy is to biodiesel. So it's a $1.20 RIN, but you generate 1.5 RINs for biodiesel and 1.7 RINs for renewable diesel. So that means a $1.20 RIN is about $1.80's worth of subsidy per wet gallon. We have another $1 per gallon biodiesel blender's tax credit. So we're getting into the $2.50 to $3 range for the subsidy per gallon. This is basically because it's an expensive fuel. I think the way to think about that, unlike all these, it's also a fuel with a very limited upside in terms of supply. This is just not going to solve greenhouse gas issues in the long run. It's not going to be a major component of the fuel supply. This is a transfer to farmers. It's for a technology that's existed since World War II. This is a transfer to producers and, depending upon the details of the blender's tax credit, to the people who sell it and blend it. I think my first choice would be to just take that. That's the way it is. That's a fact. That's a political reality. I'd love to see this taken out of the nesting structure, just have it as a separate part of the program so that we can then refocus the program on what really matters which is the second-gen advanced, and I think we can address through various issues like the ones that Ron outlined, the concerns about compliance costs with the E10 component of conventional fuels.
Okay, thank you. I had more questions, but I can see where we're going. These are going to be good discussions, and I don't want to stand in the way. So a few simple rules here at CSIS. Please wait for the microphone, because this is going to be webcast, and your words are so important we don't want the people online to miss them. Second, please identify yourself. And third, to the maximum extent possible, please ask your question in the form of a question, and stand up when speaking. So we'll start in the back center there.
Okay, thank you. Great panel. I'm John Canese, Energy Policy Consulting, former Hart Energy. I agree with the premise about transport sector being dependent on liquid fuels for a long time. As we expand this program, for the most part, we've got to look at how we're going to put those liquid fuels, let's call them mostly alcohols, into the gasoline pool. And we have an E10 blend wall, but despite the infrastructure build-out, auto manufacturer acceptance, et cetera, all those dominoes, there's one key domino at front, and that is the RVP waiver to allow anything higher than an E10 blend, i.e. going to an E15 or an E20. And I'd just like comment from the panel about where do you think that's going to go? Do you think legislatively it could get fixed, or do you think EPA will move forward on something like that?
Okay, the question is reed vapor pressure waiver for higher blends. Jim, you want to start?
Yeah, so let me just provide the technical background here. I'm not going to do the guessing of where the votes are, because that's not my expertise. So here's the deal. When you have gasoline sitting out, some of it goes up into the atmosphere. That's evaporation. Turns out that when you add a little bit of ethanol to gasoline, that there's actually more evaporation, and that's in the summer particularly bad because it can help create ozone, so you don't want to do that. So there's a waiver that allows you to use E10, even though it has a little more evaporation. More evaporation is measured by the reed vapor pressure. So there's a little bit more, and there's a waiver for E10. It turns out, for chemical reasons that I have no idea what's going on, that the reed vapor pressure and evaporative emissions goes up, and it peaks around E10, and then as you add more ethanol, it actually starts to go down. And as you get up to like E80 or something, or E75, it's less than E0. And if there's a chemist here can explain that to me, I'd love to hear it. But what the RVP waiver would do is say, hey, you know, E10 is kind of like at the worst you can get, so why not just let everybody above E10 have the same waiver? Because you're not going to be increasing the ozone stuff, and maybe you're going to even decrease it if it's around E30. For the effect of that would actually be to allow E15 and higher, and E30s and so forth, to be sold year-round. I don't know whether that's a big deal in terms of E15 market penetration, but the people in the industry say it is a big deal, say that it's tough to sell a fuel and then not have it available and then reintroduce it, and that's a hassle, and maybe it keeps you from doing the investment, and it certainly is confusing to the consumer. So if you actually were to introduce this, you could actually see substantial increases in sales. Suppose you had 4 billion gallons of E15 converted from E10 to E15, that would be about 200 million gallons in RINs. If we're about 400 million RIN gallons short, as it is right now, that would actually have a really big deflationary effect on D6 RINs. So it seems to me, in my incredibly naive Boston, Cambridge perspective, that this is something that, in fact, the obligated parties who are on the hook for these RINs should be in favor of, because it's going to be reducing their costs. And it seems to me that could be, this RVP waiver could be part of a broader package of reform of the proposal as a way to take the teeth out of the conventional E10 part of this, to take out of the conventional, take the costs out of the conventional, and refocus the program on what we need, and at the same time giving the farm interest and opportunity to sell more ethanol.
I think a lot of people naturally associate Harvard with naivete. Akash, do you want to?
I'll speak for the market, not for any one particular industry. Meeting with a couple large publicly traded ethanol CEOs in the last couple of months, I would say that with 15 billion gallons achieved for the conventional kind of implied D6 carve-out, which is mainly corn ethanol volumes, the next holy grail for the industry is pushing for E15. I think they care about that more than anything, and they're even mentioning it now on public earnings calls. But to that extent, I'm not sure every obligated party would be interested despite their high RIN costs on an accounting basis, because then what you're essentially doing is giving up market share of your fuel. So if I'm a refiner of gasoline, do I want to give up even any more incremental share, especially when I don't organically generate what my blending components are? So I think, one, that's a concern. The second is, I think there will be debate among the industry. The EPA, my fiance is a lawyer, I'm not, but my understanding of reading it is that the ASTM sets kind of gasoline properties at the state level, but EPA does have federal oversight. So I think there will be some contentious debates. As Jim alluded to, about 2/3 of the U.S. Does not allow E15 during the hotter summer months. So that's something that I think will have to be investigated. And then third, from a market adoption standpoint, right? You need to get buy-in from auto manufacturers and consumers as well. There's that debate where the EPA says any vehicle post-marketing year 2001 can take E15. The auto manufacturers are saying, no, we'll only do it post-model year 2012. So there has to be some recognition or compromise there. There's also issues with motorcycles, boats, and other vehicles with combustible engines taking E15. So I think you still have to resolve that. I do think, though, that is going to be the next real big push that's going to come out of the Renewable Fuels Association and the ethanol lobby.
Ron?
Yeah, I just want to reinforce that last point. I think there's a matter of good policy making. If you're going to, the purpose of allowing the waivers to allow the sale of E15, so you're essentially moving the blend wall, you're creating more space in the fuel supply for the ethanol, and that'll drive down the compliance costs, certainly, of the conventional D6 RINs. I think that it's a matter of good policy. If you have a policy that's going to essentially promote the sale of a particular fuel, I think that the CARB policies need to be aligned. And it is true that EPA and DOE have essentially said, any car built after 2001 can operate in E15, but the auto manufacturers often have not agreed with that. And even some cars that are still built today are built for E10, although I think most cars now indicate it. I think that if you're going to do that, it's kind of incumbent upon government to align its policies more formally. I think that the E10 is kind of set in the Clean Air Act. In the Clean Air Act, the automakers have to warrant their emission systems for a certain period of time. And I think that if you're going to do this right, that it's not just a matter of the Secretary of Energy and the Administrator of EPA putting out a notice saying that your car will operate on this fuel, even though the guy who made the car may have said you shouldn't. But it should be that the government should change the rules with respect to the warranty so that the car manufacturers have to be back there. Frankly, if I'm driving a car, and I was, that was a 2002 car that had several oil leaks in the engine because of gaskets that were in bad shape, and it was going to cost $2,000 to fix, I'm not sure that I want to put a fuel into it that the automaker said I shouldn't, even if the government said I should, unless they're going to give me their credit card.
Jim, did you have a
Yeah,
different view?
yes, I have a very different view on this matter. I mean, there's a question of whether or not E15 should be used in any particular individual's car, and I guess the individual has some responsibility for looking at their owner's manual and making that decision on his or her own. The question of the RVP waiver is a really simple one. Now, you can treat E10 and E15 differently, especially when E15 and E10 have essentially the same evaporative emissions within the margin of error of this thing, and for higher blends, it has lower evaporative emissions. So moving from E10 to E30 is better from the ozone situation than being, so if you just take, what's the question on the table? The question on the table is, are you going to make things worse off from the ozone evaporative emissions perspective by allowing this waiver? And the answer is no, you are strictly not going to, and you might make things better off in the future. So I think that's a really simple question. and it would allow E15 sales. Now, if we don't think E15 should be sold for other reasons, then that should be addressed, but actually the government, the DOE and EPA, have made assessments, and most manufacturers, 70% of auto manufacturers, make the assessment that E15 is just fine.
If I may, I will note that none of our panelists have occasioned to guess what will happen legislatively on the RVP waiver. There is apparently legislation. Those who follow Capitol Hill's meanderings through energy policy will know that in a trade-off to try to get a Congressional Review Act rescission of the methane rule imposed by the Bureau of Land Management, the Environment and Public Works Committee leadership made a deal that they would have a hearing on an RVP waiver, and they are due to consider that bill. Let me say this about that. There's a lot more to environmental opposition concerning ethanol than just evaporative emissions. So for environmentalists who are unhappy with ethanol's other potential or alleged impacts, I want to be very careful here, using more is worse. Let me also say that, as Akash mentioned, market share is not growing. We're at a fairly flat gasoline demand right now. Giving up more of the pie to another fuel doesn't necessarily make petroleum industry stakeholders happy. So therefore, to pass the RVP waiver through Congress, all you're going to have to do is to get Democrats to like pollution and to get Republicans from oil states to like ethanol. Seems like it should be easy. Next question? Really? That stopped you all. Okay. In the front, in the pink.
Good morning, Sarah Garman from the Department of Energy. My question relates to the liquid cellulosic fuels. Wanted to get your thoughts on whether or not we should carve out a separate RIN category for liquid cellulosic fuels, and also if there should be an adjustment to the cellulosic waiver credit formula.
I didn't quite, a separate RIN for
liquid
cellulosic, differentiate the liquid from the gas.
Biogas.
Yeah, differentiate the two.
Yep, and then on if we should change the statutory language with regards to the cellulosic waiver credit, how that's calculated each year.
So I don't know enough about the market for the gaseous to be able to comment on the merits of separate RINs. I have thought a lot about the cellulosic waiver credit issue and have something on my website on that. So yes, my view on cellulosic is that one of the challenges that the cellulosic manufacturers are facing, and here I'm thinking about the liquid ones, is that there's uncertainty about whether or not they'll actually be able to sell their RINs, and if they sell their RINs, what's it's going to be sold for. The statute has the opportunity for EPA, or the obligation for EPA, to issue what's called a cellulosic waiver credit, which is a surrogate for what's called a wet D3, which will allow you not to buy the D3 RIN generated by a gallon of cellulosic, but instead buy a piece of paper from the EPA to substitute for that. The idea there is if the volumes fall short, you've got this backstop. There's a price at which that trades. My understanding, my reading of the spirit, my reading of the statute, my reading of the regulations is consistent with that. Cellulosic waiver credit price is being the intention is to set a cap for the spread between the D3 RIN price and the D6, D5 RIN price. My proposal, one of the big challenges in the cellulosic area is not knowing what the volumes are going to be, and it's really tough to predict the volumes in the out years. My proposal, which I think is consistent with the court ruling that says you have to have a neutral reading, is that what could be more neutral than actually seeing the number of RINs that are produced. And then we set, at the end of the year, we set the RVO to be the number of RINs that were actually generated. And then if there's any shortfall, we'll fill it. And after you've bought all of the wet RINs, we could fill in any really small gaps that arise for accounting reasons or spilled RINs or whatever using the cellulosic waiver credit. What that would do is it would give the producers the price certainty that they're going to be trading at the cap. It provides the R&D subsidy, or the development and commercialization subsidy that is the intent of the legislation. And it is very specific to the D3 environment.
Did anybody else want to talk about subdividing the D3? Okay.
I mean, to me, I'm not sure you need to subdivide it. I think that at least one point to think about, though, is that when you look at the graph that's up there right now, I don't view gas as being the primary solution to our transportation problems. So I think that the point that at least, I think that chart's trying to make and that I would like to make is that even though there has been real growth in the D3 category in the past couple of years, up to closing in on 200 million gallons, when you look at the liquid component, it is still, measured in the single to low double-digit numbers. You're literally talking about in the hundreds of barrels per day nationwide. So.
Just add, from a market structure standpoint, I think the only reason you've seen cellulosic gas grow to still infinitesimally small in the U.S. transportation fuel system, but grow since 2012, I think is primarily due to LCFS, or the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. Because you attach in a LCFS credit plus a D3 RIN, I mean, you're getting renewable gas at $35 MMBTU, or 10 times Henry Hub equivalent. I'm not sure this is how we want to subsidize our transportation fuel system.
I think the next question is black in the center on the right.
Hi, I'm Kara Podkaminer, also from DOE. Building on sort of the last comments, many of the fuels that you've described as that certainty, are there any
This is the much more direct, which would be a combination of an R&D or commercialization type subsidy, or to give you another example, would be a cellulosic production tax credit that would have say 10 years with a phase out, and the phase out would be associated with volumes of production. That could be substantial. It would be very targeted, or instead of it just being cellulosic, it could be other second-gen liquid fuels. But that would be a completely separate tax issue through legislation, and so my proposal is trying to work through the constraints that we actually face.
Yeah, it's funny. I also just whispered tax credit is a better policy solution. I also just observe that if you were able to so much of the discussion about the RFS and so much of the attention is associated with the costs of the D6 component of the market, because that's where the obligated parties are spending most of their time trying to find and pay for those RINs. If you could kind of clear away that underbrush, it would allow us to, I think, more thoughtfully focus on what I think several of us or all of us agree is the primary purpose of the program, but just trying to figure out how to make real progress on advanced fuels. And if we're doing that, we'll find something, or we'll find that we can't find something, but at least it will be cleaner.
Any other questions from the crowd before I start to take over again? Because I have, wait, Jim?
Jim Slutz, National Petroleum Council. Just something that is floating on my mind is that you have folks advocating for higher percentage of ethanol, and ethanol has lower BTU, so lower mileage per gallon, typically. Now, so how do you reconcile? How do the folks advocating that reconcile this lower fuel economy with the desire to have increased corporate fuel economy as a country.
Let me bolt on something to his question before you answer it. There is the notion that fuel economy compliance can be achieved through higher compression engines, and higher compression engines create a demand for octane. Is there perhaps a synergy?
Yeah, well, Kevin just answered it in the form of a question, which is that looking ahead, a lot of engineering studies, and again, I'm no engineer, point towards things like E30 as having a fuel energy efficiency optimum. So I think that's not the. I guess I wouldn't necessarily share that concern. Let me say one other comment in response to something that Ron said, and then we can turn over. I guess I don't know whether I should say hopeful, but I would love to see this reset and this confluence of where we've come to at this point as an opportunity for a series of reform packages that will provide something to all of the parties. So is that a point of obligation change, which surprisingly we haven't discussed? Maybe that's part of it. Is this D6A, D6B, or D6D8 part of it? I would think that could absolutely be part of it, because that would really substantially reduce compliance costs to the obligated parties, whomever they might be. D3 reform, as we've just been discussing, would be part of it. The RVP waiver credit would be part of it. That gives something to the obligated parties. It gives something to the advanced fuels industry. It gives something to the agricultural industry. I would love to see that as a package that would essentially substantially reduce the compliance costs of this program, and at the same time pivot it towards what matters.
I would just say from an environmental standpoint, I think RFS is not as, RFS drives volumes, but it's not as complete as LCFS in California. So if you want to look at the true environmental impact, look at what California or PAD 5 region is doing between all the way from Canada down to San Diego, and with their carbon credit trading program that's coming online, they are actually looking to reduce corn ethanol and looking for other fuel paths to comply. So I think, one, that needs to be considered. As to your point on how much ethanol can be absorbed in just price economics, right now you have ethanol at parity with neat gasoline or clear gasoline. It often has traded over the last couple of years amid high RIN prices at a premium to gasoline. We see that ratio roughly when it's around up to parity or 1.1 times the clear gasoline price. It's still economical to blend ethanol, given its octane value and is a large source of oxygenate. But yes, if you continue to raise that, I think that would be an issue. I think second is just domestic nameplate capacity. We're right now running maybe 16 billion gallons per annum of ethanol nameplate capacity. We blend about 14.5 billion gallons. We're going to export over 1 billion gallons this year, gross basis. So I think, again, that's going to be a concern, because the U.S. farmer is planting 92 to 94 million acres of corn on average over the last 3-4 years. That has environmental consequences and costs. And I'm not sure, when you have 40 to 50% of the U.S. corn supply going into ethanol production, I think a full life cycle analysis on the environmental impact needs to be assessed at the RFS2 level as well, just like LCFS does.
Well, yes, of course. Jen.
Jen Delowy with Bloomberg News. Since it was invoked, I will take the opportunity to ask about the point of obligation change. Is that still in the mix? Where do you all see that going administratively? And how might that impact, if it were decided in a different way, how might that impact the final RVOs later this year?
All right. The point of obligation, abbreviated PO.
The point of obligation proposal that's just to clarify the facts or the proposal, current point of obligation, as was indicated in Akash's slide. Maybe you could bump to your slide of the RIN chain. Yeah, you've got it. There we go. Perfect, okay. So currently, the obligated party is in the lower left, which is the refiner or importer. The proposal is to change it to that gray blob in the middle, which is the blender, but actually technically it's not quite the blender, it's the person who owns the fuel right to the left of the blender there. So it's if you own the fuel going into the terminal, then you would be the obligated party. That seems like a minor technical deal. There's a lot of people on either side. My short answer is that I don't think it would make any difference for the overall functioning of the RFS, and I don't think it would make any difference in terms of the overall amount of fuels that would come out. There would be some winners and losers, but I don't think the winners and losers would actually win and lose by as much as they think they would.
Other thoughts?
Yeah. So I think that moving the point of obligation might have a little more of an effect than Jim does. I think it kind of aligns the obligation with the people who are able to undertake the activity that's required. It's clear to me at least, that the people who are currently obligated think that they're spending a lot of money, and the people who are long on RINs seem to think that they're making money on this. I appreciate that there certainly is a lot of underlying statistical analysis that kind of goes to this, and Jim has done some great work on it, and there are other people who've done work, and they're not necessarily in the same place. And frankly, I've been on the phone listening to some of the discussions, and I don't even feel myself to be expert enough to challenge that. And I certainly have all the respect in the world for both of the people, especially Jim, who's not only a former colleague, but was my statistics professor when I was in grad school. So nevertheless, I do think that it could have some effect. Look, it's part of a separate proceeding. I don't think that EPA is in any rush to make a decision right now. If I were thinking about this, I would say it's one option. It's something that we can do on our own. There may be uncertainty as to how effective it'll be, but at least it's something that we can do. There's ongoing litigation with respect to the General Waiver Credit, 2014, the General Waiver Authority, 2014, 2016. They may get bad news on that. If anyone paid attention to that litigation, it went rather poorly for the government. And I wouldn't take anything off the table if I were them, just as, a matter of, if I'm a policymaker, I want to have as many options to choose from if something goes wrong. And this is at least one to choose from. So I don't think, if I were them, I wouldn't do anything soon.
Very briefly, I think if it did happen, it wouldn't be until 2019 at the earliest for implementation, given a trial period, the fact that most racks are not set up in the EMTS system, et cetera. Second is how the market views it. I kind of take a hybrid view here. So the market definitely trades when there's very volatile RIN prices. It is reflected in the gasoline crack, or the spread between RBOB, wholesale gasoline, that's reformulated blend stock for oxygen blending, versus the crude oil price. So there is a positive correlation, and when the RIN prices move in extremes, you can see that. And you can see that in not only in the screen crack, but versus different basis levels, like in the Gulf Coast, Chicago, et cetera. So we do think that RIN cost pass-through is occurring, and if that's the case, it shouldn't as much matter if where you move the point of obligation, if that pass-through is happening in the long run. But what we can see is clearly, and you can see this in the equity markets, the way the blenders have traded versus the merchant refiners, that there isn't full pass-through. There's frictions in the system. And in particular, you can see that when you break out the cost components of wholesale, of E10, gasoline, and E85 fuel, where it has never priced competitively. And there is clearly some sort of pocketing of a high-priced RIN done at the blender level. So I think I take a view between both of my esteemed colleagues to the left and right of me, but I don't think it would even happen until 2019 at the earliest if it were to happen.
I think there's an open question as to exactly where some of that money is kind of disappearing. I mean, Jim's work, I think, shows that the pass-through is pretty complete back to the refiner, although there are people who disagree with that. I think everyone agrees that some of the value of the RIN is being lost between the rack and the retail level. That's something that I think would perhaps be better addressed through better infrastructure at the retail level. I still think that there are incentives, even if there is full pass-through to the RAC. Back to the obligated parties. I still think that there are incentives for more blending if you do move the point of obligation. And in fact, I submitted comments to EPA on this in this proceeding, and what I found is that companies that are obligated and long blend E85 at substantially fewer gas stations than companies that are obligated and short. In other words, if you are short RINs, you are more likely to sell E85 at your retail stations. You're substantially more likely to. And if you are obligated and long, you are substantially less obligated. By the same token, of all of the new E85 pumps put in between January 2013 and February of 2017, when EPA's comment period ended, I believe that 4 times as many of those pumps were installed by companies that were obligated short as opposed to those that were obligated long. So it's the same general point. If you're short and obligated, you're more likely to just sell E85, you're more likely to blend E85. So in that sense, I think that there's something going on, but I appreciate that the statistics behind exactly where the dollars are disappearing or where they're going to is complex.
We have time for exactly one last question, which goes to the center there.
Thank you. My name is Dilip Venugopal. I'm a Science and Technology Policy Fellow at EPA, and I had a question for Dosi. You briefly mentioned about environmental impacts, and my question was, do you think that reducing the biodiesel import volumes might have positive impacts on some of the environmental aspects, particularly from Indonesia and Argentina, or do you think that there is enough global or local demand that it's not going to be something like that?
So does reducing U.S. imports of biodiesel have impacts in other countries, in producing countries?
My question is, what do you think might would it have positive environmental, because some of the environmental impacts associated is like land use change and so on.
All right.
Thank you. I can't talk about the specific facilities in Indonesia, although I do know some of the companies involved there. I've not personally been there. We know that the EPA audits foreign entities in order to allow them to generate RINs. I think there is an argument by many that yes, that could potentially reduce the environmental costs of the overall program. But I think more importantly is considering from the standpoint of the entire life cycle of the entire program, right? So if you look at where the volumes are currently, yes, cellulosic is the long-term goal, or was initially the goal. We haven't gotten there. Is what is the cost to the overall environment when we look at just farmland use? Like I said, I do the agriculture outlook, so I run S&D balances for all the crops in the U.S. And there's a reason that the U.S. is planting over 90 million acres of corn each year for the last 4 or 5 years, even as farm income has declined for 4 years in a row. And RFS is obviously a huge part of it. So I think looking at the whole life cycle costs, as California does with LCFS, or a little bit more granularity, is it probably a broader point to consider than just Indonesian barrels.
To give the last word to you, Jim.
I'm just going to say one quick thing in response to this farmland issue. I think there's certainly legitimate questions about expansion of farmland in the United States. Remember, farm production, separately from all of this, is just farm productivity is increasing year after year after year. We're at 15 billion gallons right now. So whatever the issues are historically that inform this discussion of farmland debate, that's water under the bridge. That's where we are. And unless you think that, oh, well, we're going to move away and then it's no longer going to be E10, but we're going to go back to E5, and then we're going to start having aromatic, benzene or whatever it is, aromatics added for oxygenates, which we're not going to have, that's where we are right now. Are we talking about E15 having substantial impacts on that farmland? I think the answer is probably not. If anything, we're going to see the farmland and corn maybe stabilizing or possibly even decreasing because of these constant productivity gains. So I don't see E15 as having a big effect on that either.
Yields, you can't have record yields, I think, going every year, right? So we had 174 bushels an acre last year. We're going to be below trend this year. I mean, there's only so much farm productivity gains that you can have, even with seed technology and precision farming, in my view. So I do think that is something to at least consider. I agree, it's not the holy grail.
I'm reluctant to stop us here when you have decades of knowledge and billions of gallons to talk about, but only 90 minutes. Unfortunately, the clock binds us. So please join me in thanking our distinguished panel.